So today we are in the third episode of the series where we're talking about one of the main characters of the Gospels. And that character is Simon Peter. And Simon Peter is very important. He's mentioned about 200 times in the Gospels. All the other disciples together are mentioned 50 times. So you know that he's a key player. And what we see in Simon Peter's story is as his story unfolds, then we get a glimpse of Jesus. So it's in their interaction between Simon Peter and Jesus that we see who Jesus is. And then we also see this. I think we see ourselves. Because in Simon Peter, we've been calling him this flawed but faithful disciple, or this faithful but flawed disciple. And in him, we see our stories. In fact, last week, we talked about how 1 minute, Jesus looks at him after Peter says something really profound. Jesus looks at him and says, "Well done, Simon Peter, you nailed it, and you are the rock," because the name Peter means rock, and Jesus says, "You're the rock, and I'm going to build my church on you and what you have done." Wow. And then the very next minute, Peter says something really stupid, and Jesus says, "You, Peter, I can't believe you said that. You're sounding like Satan himself. You are a stumbling block to me and my mission." So just in the matter of a couple breaths, Peter goes from being the rock to being a stumbling block. And I see that and I think, that's partly my story too. I see myself in that. Of 1 minute striving to be faithful and being faithful, and the next minute doing something that I'm like, why on earth would I do that as a follower of Jesus? That's Simon's story, and it's our story, and we're drawing a lot from that. I want to pause and encourage you to do two things. I do this every week. One is to jot down some notes. Use your phone to do that, however you want to do that, just to remember things. Something might jump out at you, and you're like, yeah, and I'm going to save that one for later. The other thing that I want to encourage you to do is to use the study guide that we prepare. And we do this by series. So this series looks like this, called Failing Forward. We have it available out at the Life Desk. You can pick one up there. You can also download it online. The idea behind using the study guide is to open the Bible for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Open it, read it, see how God speaks to you through it. So today, we are continuing these glimpses of Simon Peter. And last week, where we left him and the disciples along with Jesus was in the city of Caesarea Philippi. I have a hard time saying that, which is in the very northern part of Israel. And the disciples are now making their way to Jerusalem. And what happens in Caesarea Philippi, between there and Jerusalem, is that Jesus needs to make a little stopover somewhere. And they stop over at what we call, or traditionally call, the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, that's not the name of a mountain. We actually don't know what mountain they stopped at. It could have been Mount Tabor. It could have been Mount Hermon. We don't really know. But we know that he took his disciples to this mountain. He had them all stay at the base of the mountain while he went to the top. And then he says, well, wait, I want to take Peter, James, and John with me. So Peter, James, and John go up to the top of this mountain, and something extraordinary happens. Something supernatural happens. If you're reading this, you're like, you can picture it, being something in a movie that could happen. What happens is that Jesus begins to transform in front of their eyes. So here's what it says in Luke 9:29. It says, as he was praying, as Jesus was praying up there on the mountain, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright like a flash of lightning. And the way the Greek reads here, it's not just one single flash, like he, boom, like a flash bulb went off. It's that he began to radiate light, becoming a being of light. And that's pretty cool to happen, right? I mean, that's pretty amazing to see that. Peter, James, and John are witnessing this, but something else happens. Not only that, but suddenly there are two other figures up there on the mountain with them. One is Elijah. You might recognize that name from the Old Testament. He's the prophet of all prophets. Big character in the Old Testament. Then, along with Elijah, Moses shows up. Moses is the guy that led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. He's the one that God gave the Ten Commandments to. It's like, wow, these are the two biggest names in the Old Testament that show up there. And they're talking with Jesus, who's radiating light. What's going on here? Don't you got to wonder, why is this happening? It's so out of the ordinary. And the thing is, the text doesn't tell us what's going on here or why. It just describes the scene. But I think what's happening here is that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And last week, or a week before this event, he had told his disciples, we're heading to Jerusalem because that's where I'm going to be captured, and I'm going to be tortured, and I'm going to be killed. And I think Jesus is pausing here, and this thing unfolds so that he can kind of say, is it really time? He needs to hear from the prophet of all prophets. He needs to hear from Moses, the lawgiver. Am I really doing what I'm supposed to be doing here? Is it time? And I think in that moment, we don't hear them say this. We don't know what Elijah said or Moses said, but what clearly happens there is they're communicating to him, yep, Jesus, it's time. It's time to bring all this to a conclusion. Well, Peter's up there with them, and Peter can't just sit and watch this. Peter's like, hey, this is amazing. This is amazing up here. I mean, these are my heroes from the Old Testament, and my hero in my life right now, Jesus. All this is happening. He's like, let's stay up here. Well, I want to build some houses up here so that we can stay on this mountaintop moment. I mean, that's kind of how we like to have mountaintop moments, isn't it? He doesn't want to go back to normal. He wants to keep this thing going. But isn't it long before there's a cloud that forms, and God says, while Peter's saying, hey, let's build some houses up here for all of us, God speaks and says, this is my son, marked by my love, focus of my delight. Listen to him. Listen to him. I think Peter, James, and John needed to hear and see what was going on there, because Jesus had told them, I'm going to head to Jerusalem and I'm going to die there. And it grieved them so much. I think they needed to see this scene so that they were encouraged through the dark times of Jesus' arrest and betrayal and crucifixion before he came back from the dead. They needed to know that it was going to be okay. I think this was crucial to that. Well, Jesus changes back to normal. He's the person they recognize now. Elijah and Moses go back to wherever they came from. And Jesus says, all right, we can't stay here. We've got to go back down into real life. We got to go back into the real world. I think he's saying, mountaintop moments like this happen. And you've had them happen to you before, right? Mountaintop moments happen, but you can't stay on the mountaintop. Pretty common saying, right? You can't stay on the mountaintop because the mountaintop moment is something that's meant to change you, and it's something that you're meant to share with others for whatever reason that mountaintop moment happened. Have you had one of those before? Something pretty powerful with God? I mean, I've had a few that as I recalled back, I think some of them have happened in worship services right here, where I've had a moment in worship where I don't want this to end. This is so good. It's never while I'm preaching. I don't know. It's usually while the band's playing. I'm like, I kind of like this. Some of them happened when I was a kid at camp. Those moments at camp. And I remember as a kid, I didn't want to leave my camp experiences. We hear about kids that go to Mix and Move, those conferences for them. And they're like, I don't want to come home. I've had some big adventures that I've gone on and conferences that I've been to. Like, oh my gosh, the powerful sense of the Spirit is here. I don't want to go. But the message here is you got to go. Because the mountaintop experience isn't meant to be enjoyed in and of itself. It's meant to be shared so that you come down from the mountain and say, this is what I saw. This is what I experienced. So Jesus, Peter, and James, and John, they head down the mountain. They make their way to Jerusalem with the other disciples who are waiting down there. And when they get to Jerusalem, the next glimpse of Simon Peter happens. And this is where they prepare for the Last Supper. And now, when the disciples are gathering for the Last Supper, they don't know it's the Last Supper, even though Jesus has told them these things are going to unfold. Only, really, Jesus knows what's going on here. Jesus had made arrangements for them to have this meal on the second floor of a house. A lot of times, what is that? A lot of times, oh my gosh, I got thrown off. So they have this meal on the second floor of a house. We call it the upper room. I don't care what Google is saying over there. We call it the upper room. And Jesus had made these arrangements, right? All the disciples start arriving at this place where they're going to celebrate the Passover meal. It's the Jewish Passover, and it's meant to be celebrated together in groups like this. So they're there, getting ready to celebrate the Passover. The disciples arrive at this place that Jesus has prepared. And etiquette then was that there was always a basin of water and a towel at the door of every home for every gathering. Why was there a basin and towel? Because people walked everywhere, right? And they wore sandals, but their feet were always dirty. You can imagine it. The roads are made of dirt, and so if it's dry, your feet get dusty. If it's muddy, your feet get coated in mud. So it was just common etiquette. Walk in a house, and at that household, the common etiquette was that the lowest servant among everybody was the one that washed the feet of whoever came. Well, Jesus hadn't made arrangements for a servant to be there to wash their feet, so the disciples arrive, and a number of things could have unfolded, right? They could have washed their own feet, We do you think about that? Why didn't you wash your own feet? Well, they didn't do that. Or one of them could have stepped up and said, hey, I'll do it. It's on me this time. Come on over here. I'll get your feet. Nobody did that. Or somebody could have pulled rank. That should have been Peter, probably. You can imagine Peter saying, hey, I'm second in command here. I'm the rock. Come on, somebody, get our feet. Nobody does it. In fact, Luke tells us that as they arrive for the meal, they're arguing with one another about who is the greatest. And when Jesus takes his role as king of all kings, which one of us is going to be his closest ally? Who's going to be in the inner circle? And that's what they're arguing about. So you can tell, none of them is interested in washing their own feet. They're waiting for somebody else to do that because, well, they're better than that. And then Jesus walks in. And as we read the text, he didn't say anything. He just walks in. He knows what's going on. He takes off his coat, hangs it on a hook, gets the basin and the towel. The disciples probably were reclining at the table. They didn't have tables and chairs like we do. The tables were low, and you just reclined on it, maybe a cushion, and you put your elbow on the table, and your feet went out from the table, so your feet were there. And Jesus takes the basin of water and a towel, and he begins to wash the disciples' grimy feet. Now, we can picture that in our minds, but what we can't really grasp in 21st century America is how utterly shocking that was. It just wasn't done in a hierarchical society. The teacher did not wash the students' feet. The master did not wash the disciples' feet. And just the week before, the disciples had pretty much figured out that Jesus wasn't just a teacher or a master, a rabbi, that he was the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords. And here is the King of all kings, the Lord of all lords, washing the road grime from between their toes. We have a hard time getting our minds around exactly what that meant. We get a little glimpse of it through Peter. Peter says this. He says, no, when Jesus gets to him, Peter says, no, you will not wash my feet. But Jesus looks up at him and says, if I don't wash you, you can't be part of what I'm doing. And so he washes all their disciples' feet. And then Jesus looks at them and says afterwards, if you want to be great, this is what it looks like. If you want to be great, this is what it looks like. Be willing to serve. Be willing to do the thing that is humbling. Be willing to do the thing that is actually even humiliating. What does that look like for us? This is what Jesus is modeling, not just for the 12 disciples in the room, for us. I don't know if this relates real closely, but my daughter Abby and I, we volunteer at Cross Lines. We try to get there every Monday evening, and we serve there. When we first went, the very first time, there was a volunteer coordinator that took us around Cross Lines to show us what they do. And by the way, Cross Lines, they help people with food assistance, making sure that the hungry have food and clothing. They have a shop where people can shop for clothes. They do some rent assistance, that sort of thing. They have small appliances and that sort of thing for families that are, just need those sorts of things. So they took us around all these different spots in there. And when they came to the place where they had the small appliances, talking lamps and toasters and that sort of thing, I really lit up. And I'm like, oh, this is where you want me working, because I love to fix things. That is my passion. I'm a handyman, just kind of pretending I'm a pastor, really. I love fixing things. So put me in here to fix these lamps and do all this stuff, and you got a gem in me to help you out here. And the lady said, oh, that's nice, Aaron. But we actually have somebody that does that. And where I need you to help today, and probably most of the time, is over here. And so she takes us into the room where they receive the fresh produce from area grocery stores. And in that area, what they do, a lot of it, the food is still good, but there might be some spoilage in there. So what they do is they separate out the spoiled so that the good stuff people can still eat. And so that day, she's like, here are these bags of oranges, and there are a couple of rotten oranges in each bag. We need you to go through that and sort out the rotten fruit. And then here are these flats of strawberries. There are always a few rotten strawberries. They're still good to eat, except for the rotten ones. So I need you to pick those out. So I picked rotten fruit out. I'm like, lamps and small appliances, and, I have a master's degree, and I'm an ordained elder. And so So as long as we have been volunteering down there, I've never once fixed a lamp or an appliance. But I'm an expert at sorting rotten fruit. And here's what I do. Here's what I've learned to do. As I sort the oranges, I sort the strawberries or whatever it might be for that day, or I'm sorting clothes that have been donated in big bags and we're hanging them up and sorting those and getting them on hangers. I try to, the right word is not pray over those, but I try to just take some of the love of God that God put in me, and I try to put some of that onto that orange that I'm putting in the good bag. And in those strawberries, I try to put some of the love of God there, or that shirt that I'm hanging up, put some of the love of God that He gave me, I'm trying to put it on there so that the person who eats that orange or the person that eats that strawberry, even though they'll never see me, the person that wears that t-shirt, somehow, some way, they know God loves them. Why do I do that? It's kind of humiliating in a way. I come off always smelling like something weird when I come out across lines. But part of the reason I do that is Jesus washed 3 feet. He said, if you want to be great, this is what it looks like. Staff, our staff here at the church, we have a staff culture, a list of statements, the we believe statements. Here's one of our we believe statements as a staff. We believe the staff should lead the way in serving, that we should be the first ones to pick up trash, pull weeds, and clean up poop. You'd be surprised how much poop just happens around here. And that's not what you pay us to do. You don't pay us to do that. We believe that as staff because Jesus washed dirty feet. We want to model that for you so that you are doing the same. Because if you want to be great, and I want you to be great, and I want to be great, it looks like serving. And that's why we talk about the 5 practices of the faith. One of them is to serve, and that looks like serving here at the church in some way. It looks like serving in the community in some way. It looks like doing 5 acts of kindness every day. It's meant to be part of the Christian life. What a glimpse. Here's the next glimpse we get of Simon Peter. It's at the same meal. Jesus is sitting at the table with his disciples, and at one point in that meal, he says, tonight, one of you will betray me. And as shocked as they were when Jesus washed their feet, this is an earthquake in their minds and in their faith. They can't believe it. They don't know that Judas Iscariot has already sealed the deal. They don't know that Jesus knows that. They don't know that Judas has already made the arrangements for when he's going to point out to the religious authorities, that's Jesus, take him, grab him up. So they're all in shock, but then Jesus says, don't be so shocked. The rest of you are going to desert me. One of you will betray me, the rest are you going to desert me. And that's when Simon Peter speaks up. He says this, even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you. These other guys, they may run, but not me, because my name is the Rock. I'm the Rock. I'm the second in command. I'm your wingman, Jesus. Then Jesus looks at him and says, I tell you the truth, Peter, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Deny that you even know me. Peter insisted, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. Got a couple questions to ask. You think Peter meant what he said there that night, in that setting? Think he meant it? I do. I think he did. I just don't think he knew how it was going to go down, and that it was going to go down in just a few hours. Jesus and the disciples, they wrap up their Passover meal. They sing a hymn together, and traditionally that would be Psalm 118. It's dark when they leave that upper room, and they leave that building. They have to go through town a little bit. They would have passed the temple on their left as they went down through the Kidron Valley and up the other side to the Garden of Gethsemane. It was about a 30-minute walk. The Garden of Gethsemane was one of Jesus' favorite places to go. It was an olive grove, so quaint and intimate and quiet, a garden. And he says to his disciples, you guys wait here because I'm going to go pray over there. I need a little bit of alone time, but I want you close. I want you close. I need you. I mean, he's telling his disciples, I need you here. I need you close. And this is where he prays that prayer, Father, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Jesus is in agony, and he's afraid, and he's worried. So he's over here a little ways praying. The disciples are over here waiting. Jesus says that prayer or something like that, and then he ends up going back to his disciples. I don't know why, but he goes over to them, and he finds them, what are they doing? They're sleeping. They're sleeping. And so he wakes them up and says, can't you just wait with me for a while here? I need you. I need you to be alert with me. Won't you pray with me? But I need to go over here by myself for a little while. So he goes. This happens 3 times when he goes back and finds them sleeping. Again, this is our story, isn't it? I've watched some of you fall asleep while I'm up here talking. And some of you are asleep right now and don't know I'm talking about you. It's okay, though. It's okay. I've literally fallen asleep writing my own sermons, just dozing off, like, oh my gosh, But I think there's something in this, too, about our spiritual lives, that call to pray 5 times a day. As soon as you wake up in the morning, and then all 3 meals, and then when you go to bed at night, that bedtime, that one at night, I hear so many people, I've been there myself, it's so hard to pray at night when you're laying in bed. Maybe this is a call for us to get on our knees. Take that posture of prayer that might be a little more active, that might allow our prayers to actually be spoken. But this is our story. Well, the 3rd time Jesus comes out, wakes up his disciples, he says this, Matthew 26:46, wake up, look, my betrayer is here, and it's Judas, and he's leading this group of soldiers from the temple. The Jewish temple had its own set of guards and soldiers that were there, and they've got torches and swords and clubs, and Judas walks right up to Jesus and betrays him with a kiss. Peter knows what's going down. And here's what John tells us happened. Just then, Simon Peter, who was carrying a sword, pulled it from its sheath and struck the chief priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Malchus was the servant's name. All 4 Gospels tell us that this happened. It's John that tells us that Simon Peter was the one packing that night. And he lops off this guy's ear. I found an ancient painting of that. I don't know if that's what it really looked like or not. It tells me a couple things about Peter. That he did this. Number 1, he really was ready to die with Jesus, because there they are. They're a bunch of disciples, fishermen, tax collectors, and whatnot, and there is a group of armed soldiers around them, and Peter's like, don't care, I'm throwing down. Brings out his sword and goes at it. He doesn't care. He's ready to die with Jesus that night. It also tells me the second thing about Peter. He had really bad aim. He was a fisherman, not a soldier. Jesus turns to Peter and he says, put away your sword. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us and he would send them instantly? And Jesus is simply telling Peter, I told you this was going to happen. Why are you surprised? Why are you reacting like this? Put away your weapons. And Luke tells us that Jesus reaches down and picks up the guy's ear and puts it back on his head and heals him. He heals one of the thugs that is there to arrest him, torture, and kill him. And then Jesus says this, if you're looking for me, let these men go. Says that to the soldiers. And we don't know what happens in that moment, but it was just enough time for all the disciples to disappear into the night. The soldiers tied Jesus' hands, probably behind his back, and they lead him out of the Garden of Gethsemane, back through the Kidron Valley, over past the temple to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. And we talk about a home, you picture a house. It really was a complex of houses. It was a dungeon there. There was a tribunal area there. So it's a pretty large complex of buildings. I've visited there in the Holy Land. It's where Jesus was put on trial. The scriptures say that while all the other disciples ran away, Peter and John followed at a distance. And again, I'm thinking, what incredible courage. They're in the shadows, but they're still following it. They're in the shadows, but they're still following. They're in the shadows, but they're still following. And that just struck me this morning. I wonder if some of you are in the shadows, still following. Maybe you're in the shadows, just, this whole faith thing. You don't really want to talk about it at work. You don't really want anybody to know what's going on in your faith world. You're in the shadows, but still following. There's a courtyard outside this house, and there are people there that are coming and going. So it wasn't hard to sort of blend in. Peter comes out of the darkness and just walks up to a place where some servants had started a fire. So, I don't know, I picture a barrel, 50-gallon barrel there. That's not what it was, but they're them gathering around, warming themselves, and in the firelight, what's one more person who's gathered around there? Where Peter is standing at that fire, he can see Jesus. Now, I don't know if Jesus is just tied up in the courtyard. It doesn't tell us. Maybe he's in part of the building and there's a window. I don't know. But there's Peter. He can see Jesus. And what I think is happening here is that Peter's trying to figure out a way to bust Jesus out of there. Again, the courage. I'll never say that Peter wasn't courageous. But while he's standing there by the firelight, trying to figure out what to do, here's what happened next. This is Luke 22. A servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. And finally she said, "This man was one of Jesus' followers." Somehow she knew him. But Peter denied it. "Woman, I don't even know him." After a while, somebody else looked at him and said, "You must be one of them." "No, man, I'm not." Peter retorted. Stuck around another hour. About an hour later, somebody else insisted, "This must be one of them because he's a Galilean too." He had an accent, right? But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter so they could see each other. Suddenly, the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. "Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." And Peter left the courtyard weeping bitterly. And you know what Peter's feeling in that moment, right? Shame, failure, betrayal. Here's what I think we're supposed to get from this event. I think we're supposed to recognize that we have all been Simon Peter along the way. And I doubt, maybe it's happened, but I doubt that anybody in this room has just plain out, openly, verbally denied Jesus in some way, but I think we've all denied Jesus in other ways. Here's what I mean. I'm pretty sure there are moments where you were a witness to something was happening and God needed a Christian to stand up and say something. And you didn't do it. I'm not pointing a finger because I've been there. Listening to another pastor talk about this, and he said that a member of his church discovered his grandfather's journals and was reading his grandfather's journals, and in one of the journals, his grandfather talked about coming upon a lynching. And it was so shocking and disturbing and so horrifying to him, but he stood there as a Christian thinking somebody should do something, and he did nothing. See, I don't think it's a question of if you will deny Jesus, or I will deny Jesus. It's a question of how and when. Here's another question. Why do you think all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell the story about Peter's betrayal? Peter's seen as one of the great heroes of our faith. In the early church too, he was seen as a great hero of the faith. Why put in this moment of his greatest humility and humiliation? Why put that in there? Why put it in there? Why highlight it in all 4 of the Gospels and tell the story over and over again? The answer is pretty clear. The Gospel writers put it in there because Peter himself told this story of his betrayal over and over and over and over again. Every time Peter had a chance to talk to people, he said, "I'm the one who betrayed Jesus. I'm the one that denied knowing him." Every time he had a chance to talk to a little cluster of new Christians, he would say, "This is my story. I want you to hear how I betrayed him." Every time that he talked to people that were not yet followers of Jesus and he was trying to tell them the story, he said, I betrayed him. You don't have to be perfect. I betrayed him, and look, I'm in it. I think that's why the gospel writers have this in there. Why would Peter tell the story over and over and over again? I think it was to tell people, if you have ever failed Jesus, or when you do fail him, listen, there's hope for you too. We'll get a little bit ahead of our story because the hope for Peter is after the resurrection, Jesus has a face-to-face time with just Peter. And Jesus says this to Peter. He says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter responds, "Oh, Jesus, you know I love you." Peter asks the second time, Peter, do you love me? Peter says, oh, Jesus, you know I love you. The third time, Peter asks him, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, Jesus, you know I love you. Now, those weren't magical words. They were just Jesus getting Peter to say, I'm still here, and I know you love me, and I know you've forgiven me and restored me. Part of what I want us to recognize in the story is that we've denied Jesus. Part of what I also want us to recognize is that in telling our story of our denial, that might help someone who is feeling like Jesus won't ever welcome them in or welcome them back. You have to tell your story of restoration. I know from preaching for many, many years that when I tell you how I've messed up, that is so much more powerful than when I tell you when I get it right. You know, it's when I tell you when I've messed up and I got a speeding ticket and it was just bad, you know, because I was in a hurry and I wasn't thinking, whatever it is, you're like, thank you for sharing that because I feel more normal. Or when I tell you that I got so angry that I ripped a cupboard door off its hinges, you know, when I tell you that, oh, thank you for sharing that, Aaron, I appreciate that because it lets, you know, you're human. And that's why Peter's telling his story. That's why you have to tell your story, because somebody out there is not going to connect or reconnect to Jesus unless they hear how you've blown it and how you were restored. We're all going to deny Jesus at some point, but what you did in denying him doesn't have to be the end of the story. Remember this as we close. Got to wrap this up. Jesus is the Lord of the second chance over and over and over again. And Simon Peter's story just reminds us of that in such clear pictures. And then the second thing is that God can use your shortcomings, your failures, your embarrassing moments for his glory if you let him. And I'm here to stand on the stage and tell you, please let him. That's our glimpse today of Simon Peter, this flawed but faithful but flawed disciple. It's like you and me. And for today, that is the good news. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.